It is 2:07 in the morning on July 16th, 2026, and the phone will not stop buzzing. A woman named Jacqueline Gonzalez is asleep near Uvalde, Texas, when a friend's call cuts through the dark. "There's a tornado warning," the voice says. "Get up, get moving." Jacqueline swings her legs out of bed. Her feet hit the floor. The carpet is wet. Not damp, wet. Somewhere outside, a river that had no business being anywhere near her house has already arrived at her doorstep, and she does not yet know it is only getting started. 40 miles away, outside Batesville, a woman named Kat Sprawls has her phone on Do Not Disturb. It takes 5 calls, then 6, before the sound finally breaks through and wakes her. It is 3:30 in the morning. A friend is on the line, and the message is simple and terrible. The water is coming. It is already near her home. Kat gets up in the dark, heart pounding, and realizes she almost slept through it. This is the kind of night the Texas Hill Country has learned to fear, and for the people living along the Guadalupe River, the Nueces, the Llano, the Pedernales, this particular night carries a second, sharper layer of dread because they have lived through something like it before. Almost exactly 1 year earlier, to the week, the same stretch of Texas became the site of one of the deadliest flash floods in modern American history. Now, in the summer of 2026, the sky over Hill Country has opened again, and the rivers are climbing through the same valleys, past the same bridges, toward homes that were only just rebuilt. To understand why this land keeps drowning, you have to understand what it is. Meteorologists have a nickname for this stretch of central Texas. They call it Flash Flood Alley. It is not hyperbole. It is a description of geology and geography conspiring in the worst possible combination. The hill country sits on the Edwards Plateau, a landscape of thin soil layered over limestone bedrock. Limestone does not absorb water the way soil does. It sheds it. When rain falls here, especially heavy rain, it does not soak into the ground. It runs. It gathers in narrow valleys and steep-walled canyons carved over millions of years, and it funnels downhill with tremendous speed into rivers that can rise not over days, but over minutes. Add to that a climate that swings violently between extremes. Central Texas can sit in punishing drought for months, baking the ground until it turns nearly as hard as concrete. And then, almost without warning, a tropical moisture plume rolls up from the Gulf of Mexico and collides with that same hardened earth. The water has nowhere to go but down the hillsides and into the rivers. Meteorologists call this setup a flood on top of a drought, and it is one of the most dangerous rainfall patterns in North America. It is also, tragically, close to a signature condition for this exact region. Texas is not the only place in America where this kind of terrain exists, but it may be the deadliest combination of geography and population anywhere in the country. The same limestone hills that make the region so beautiful, the swimming holes, the cypress-lined rivers, the dude ranches and summer camps that have drawn families here for 100 years, are the very features that turn an ordinary storm into a killer. Flood scientists sometimes rank Flash Flood Alley alongside a short list of the most dangerous flash flood zones in the entire United States. A list that also includes parts of the Ozarks and stretches of the desert Southwest, but few of those regions combine the steep runoff of hill country with the sheer number of children's camps, RV parks, and low-water river crossings packed into its valleys. There are hundreds of low-water crossings across this stretch of Texas alone, simple dips in the road where a driver might cross a dry creek bed 9 days out of 10 and drown attempting the exact same crossing on the 10th. This is not a new discovery. It is a lesson the hill country has been forced to learn again and again for nearly a century. Records show the Guadalupe River Basin has experienced more than 40 major floods over the past 100 years, and many of them have been deadly. In 1932, a flood along the river killed 7 people. In 1978, a tropical storm stalled directly over the hill country and unleashed nearly 4 feet of rain in places, triggering flooding that killed 33. But the disaster that would come to define this region's collective memory, the one that people in Kerr County would still be talking about 38 years later, happened on a July morning in 1987, on the very same river that would flood again in 2025 and 2026. On the evening of July 16, 1987, a line of thunderstorms repeatedly passed over the same patch of ground near the headwaters of the Guadalupe, a meteorological phenomenon known as training, where storm after storm rides the same track like train cars on a rail. Nearly 12 inches of rain fell in about 45 minutes near Hunt, and the river responded exactly the way it always does on this terrain. It rose 25 feet in under an hour. More than 300 children were staying that week at a church camp called Pot O Gold Ranch, just outside the small town of Comfort. As the water climbed toward them in the dark, camp leaders made the call to evacuate. A caravan of buses and a van pulled out just after 7 in the morning, trying to outrun a river that was already ahead of them. The last bus in that caravan, carrying 43 campers and staff, stalled in rising water on a low crossing. A church van behind it was trapped too. With the water still climbing, the group made a desperate decision. They would leave the vehicles and form a human chain, walking together toward higher ground. It was not enough. A wall of water, witnesses would later say nearly 10 feet high, tore through the chain and scattered them into the river. Reverend Richard Coons, then a 26-year-old youth pastor, was in that water. He would recall, decades later, that the river reached about 35 feet deep around them almost instantly, that people climbed onto the roof of the stalled bus and then into nearby trees, stripping off their pants and knotting them together into makeshift ropes to haul children up out of the current. His wife, Lavonda, was swept downstream, certain she was going to die, until she managed to grab hold of a small tree and hang on until a rescue boat found her. Army helicopters were called in. Soldiers were lowered on lines into the floodwater to pull survivors from the trees. One 14-year-old girl, twice lifted partway to safety on a helicopter line, fell 90 feet to her death when the line gave way. By the time the water receded, 10 of the 43 campers on that bus were dead. One body was never recovered. In the aftermath of 1987, Kerr County did make some changes. The dangerous low water crossing near the camp was replaced with a bridge. A memorial plaque was placed at the ranch entrance. And in 1989, the Upper Guadalupe River Authority installed what was described at the time as the Hill Country's first ever flood alert system, a network of 22 sensors along the river and its tributaries, feeding real-time data back to a central office. It was a genuine step forward. But it was also, in hindsight, only a fraction of what a region this vulnerable actually needed. And over the following decades, much of the broader momentum for flood infrastructure faded the way it so often does once the news cameras leave and the grief becomes private. 38 years later, almost to the day, the same river proved that the lesson had not been fully learned. In the early hours of July 4, 2025, a slow-moving storm system stalled directly over the headwaters of the Guadalupe in Kerr County, echoing the training storm pattern of 1987 with brutal precision. Rain fell in staggering amounts, more than a foot in some places within hours. Along a stretch near Hunt, the river climbed roughly 26 feet in about 45 minutes, almost the exact rise, and almost the exact time frame recorded 38 years earlier just a short distance away. Among the camps in the flood's path was Camp Mystic, a century-old girls' summer camp on the banks of the Guadalupe. Cabins full of sleeping children were engulfed as the water surged through in the dark. Counselors tried to move kids to higher ground with flashlights and instinct because, unlike Pot O' Gold in 1987, where camp officials at least had hours of warning before the fatal evacuation attempt, no functioning siren sounded here in time to matter. By the time the sun rose over Kerr County, the scale of what had happened was only beginning to reveal itself, and it kept growing in the days that followed as search teams worked the riverbanks. When the counting was finally done, the death toll from that single flood event across the region had climbed past 100 lives, among them dozens of children. It became one of the deadliest inland flooding disasters in the United States in decades, and it reopened a wound in Kerr County that had never fully closed since 1987. In the weeks after, the anger followed the grief the way it always does when a warning system fails a community for the second time in living memory. Investigators and journalists asked the same question people had asked in 1987. How did a flood this catastrophic arrive with so little notice in a place that had been drowned by the same river before, in almost the same spot, under almost the same conditions? The answers were not comforting. Kerr County still did not have a modern, comprehensive outdoor siren network along the river decades after the 1989 gauge system had been installed and then allowed to age without the follow-up investment such infrastructure demands. Camps in the floodplain operated under safety rules that had not meaningfully changed since the previous century. Emergency alerts, where they existed at all, were inconsistent, reliant on a patchwork of local agencies with different resources, different budgets, and different protocols. For families who lost children on the 4th of July, the explanation that this was simply an act of nature was never going to be enough, not when their grandparents could have told them almost the identical story about 1987. So Texas made promises. State officials, camp operators, and county leaders stood in front of cameras in the aftermath and vowed real change. New flood sirens would finally be installed along the river, the kind that outdoor warning systems in other flood-prone parts of the country had used for years. Camps in flood-prone areas would face tighter safety requirements, including limits on where cabins could be built and clearer, mandatory evacuation protocols. River gauges would be upgraded to give faster, more accurate readings, so that a rise like the one recorded in July 2025 could be caught and communicated before it became a wall of water crashing through a cabin wall. Millions of dollars were pledged. Task forces were formed. For a grieving region, it was the only thing that made the unbearable feel survivable. Never again, people said. This time, we will be ready. But building that kind of infrastructure takes time, and disasters do not wait for governments to finish their work. As the one-year anniversary of the flood approached in the summer of 2026, some of those promised upgrades were in place. Others were still incomplete. And then, in the second week of July 2026, the sky over the hill country began to look disturbingly familiar. to understand why warning systems in this region kept failing and why they only partially succeeded even after 100 lives were lost. It helps to understand how a flood warning is actually supposed to travel from a river gauge to a sleeping family. Modern systems rely on a chain of steps that all have to work in sequence. A sensor in the river has to detect the rise. That data has to reach a National Weather Service office where a meteorologist has to interpret it correctly and quickly. A warning then has to be issued, and that warning has to be pushed out through multiple channels at once. Cell phone alerts under the Federal Wireless Emergency Alert System, no AA weather radios, local sirens, social media, and old-fashioned phone trees run by county emergency managers. If any single link in that chain is missing, slow, or under-resourced, the warning can arrive minutes too late, or not arrive at all, no matter how sophisticated the sensor upstream might be. In much of rural hill country, several of those links were still being built or rebuilt when the July 2026 storm arrived, which is part of why some communities heard sirens for the first time in their lives that week, while others, only a few counties away, were still relying on a neighbor's phone call in the middle of the night. Meteorologists watched an upper-level disturbance settle into place above central Texas, an unusually strong ridge of high pressure locking a rotating pocket of moisture almost directly over the same watershed that had flooded the year before. Scientists call this kind of feature a mesoscale convective vortex, a slow spinning engine of thunderstorms that, instead of moving through and clearing out, parks itself over one place and keeps firing rain into the same ground again and again. Texas state climatologist John Nielsen Gammon would later describe the setup to reporters as a clockwise circulation that essentially trapped the storm system in place over hill country, refusing to let it move on. For a region already saturated from days of earlier rain, that stall was catastrophic. Every drop that fell had nowhere to soak in. It could only run the same way it ran in 1987 and 2025. Rain began falling on Tuesday, July 14th. By Wednesday, it had intensified. By Thursday, July 16th, the National Weather Service was warning of a level 4 out of 4 risk for life-threatening flooding across a wide swath of the region, particularly along the corridor west of San Antonio. Rainfall rates were reaching 2 to 4 inches per hour in the worst bands, an intensity that overwhelms creeks and low water crossings almost instantly. Forecasters projected some pockets could see an additional 10 to 15 inches on top of what had already fallen. Meteorologist Chris Jackson, watching the radar that morning, wrote online that barely 1 year after the catastrophic flooding through Kerrville, history was repeating itself. For a region still rebuilding, he said, this was the last thing anyone wanted to see. And repeat it did. The gauge along the Guadalupe near Hunt, the same stretch that had exploded upward in 1987 and again in 2025, rose 32 feet in just 4 hours. Forecasters watched the numbers climb in real time and warned that the river could crest at a level rivaling the catastrophic flood of the year before. Further west, the Nueces River near Uvalde did something almost unimaginable. It set a new record crest, and at its peak was releasing water at roughly twice the rate that pours over Niagara Falls. Picture that. Not a waterfall as a tourist attraction, a waterfall of that same violent volume, but running through a Texas river valley lined with homes, ranches, and roads instead of a scenic overlook. Across Kerr, Uvalde, Real, Kendall, and Gillespie counties, the emergency unfolded through the night and into the following days. In Gillespie County, water was reported rising at a public playground. In Sonora, submerged vehicles and waterlogged buildings lined the streets, and floodwater was strong enough to lodge what appeared to be large storage tanks against a bridge. Interstate 10 near Arizona was partially flooded after a normally dry draw burst its banks, cutting off a stretch of one of the country's major east-west highways. Evacuations were ordered. Roads closed across the region, one after another, as county officials tracked the water's advance, almost the way a battlefield commander tracks an advancing front. Emergency crews launched what would become more than 230 water rescues, pulling people from cars, from rooftops, from the tops of stranded motorhomes, from houses that had been dry 24 hours earlier. The human cost, while smaller than the horror of the year before, was still measured in real lives that mattered to real families. 65-year-old Mark Stewart, a longtime Kerrville resident, was swept away near Comfort, that same small town where the 1987 flood had claimed its 10 young victims, when the recreational vehicle he was in was overtaken by rising water. His wife, Jenny, later shared her grief publicly, saying her heart was broken and that she was devastated, and describing her husband as the man who had made her a better person during the years they shared. Near Uvalde, a woman driving her car was caught by the surge and killed when the vehicle was swept from the road. Governor Greg Abbott confirmed both deaths in briefings as the disaster unfolded, and he issued a major disaster declaration for the state as the death toll and rescue numbers climbed through the week. But this time, something was different, and it mattered enormously. For the first time, the flood sirens installed in the wake of the 2025 tragedy activated along stretches of the Guadalupe River, And this time, campers in the path of the surge received real, audible warning in the dark instead of silence. Kerr County officials were able to report that all campers in their jurisdiction were accounted for as the water rose, a sentence that 1 year earlier had been unimaginable, and 39 years earlier in 1987 had also proven tragically false. Residents described the difference themselves in their own words. People said that a year of preparation, imperfect and incomplete as it still was, had made a real difference. That phones buzzed with alerts that never came the year before, that sirens cut through the night in places that had been eerily silent in 2025. Yet the story of this second flood is not simply a story of lessons learned. It is also a story of lessons still unlearned, spread across a region too large and too rural to fix in a single year. A review of emergency alert data by the Associated Press found no wireless emergency alerts listed as sent by agencies in Uvalde County, one of the hardest hit areas, even as water rose through the night and eventually claimed a life there. It is possible those agencies warned residents through other channels, but the gap in the official record echoed, uncomfortably, the same warning failures investigated after 2025, and the same failures investigated after 1987. Kat Sprawls, the woman whose phone buzzed 5 or 6 times before finally waking her at 3:30 in the morning, learned about the rising floodwater, not from an official government alert, but from a friend who happened to know and happened to call. Jacqueline Gonzalez woke not to a siren, but to a phone call about a tornado, and found the water already inside her home before she understood what kind of night this was. The system built after the deadliest flood in the region's recent memory had worked in some places, for some people, and had not reached others in time. Again, the financial toll of a disaster like this is almost impossible to calculate cleanly, but it compounds with every repeat event. Homes rebuilt after 2025, some with fresh paint, barely a year old, were flooded again in 2026. Businesses in towns like Kerrville and Ingram, still working through insurance claims and reconstruction loans from the year before, faced a second round of water damage before the first round had even been paid off. Ranchers lost fencing, livestock, and topsoil for the second summer in a row. Local governments, already stretched thin funding new sirens and gauges, now had to redirect money toward emergency response and debris removal instead of finishing the very infrastructure projects meant to prevent exactly this kind of repeat disaster. Economists who study natural catastrophes have a term for this cycle: disaster fatigue, the point at which repeated losses in the same community begin to outpace the region's financial and emotional capacity to recover. And Hill Country, entering its second consecutive summer of catastrophic flooding, was edging uncomfortably close to that threshold. By Friday, July 17th, forecasters projected the worst of the rain would finally wind down, and a drying trend was expected to return to inland Texas over the weekend. Recovery crews, including specialized search and rescue units like Texas A&M Task Force 1, moved into hard-hit areas like Lowry Park and Kerrville to assess the damage left behind. The floodwaters that had turned roads into rivers began slowly to recede, leaving behind mud, wrecked vehicles, and a region forced once again, for the third time across 3 generations, to count what it had lost along this one river. What makes this third disaster, following 1987 and 2025, so unsettling is not only what happened, but what it reveals about the gap between promise and preparation. In the year between the 2 most recent floods, Texas had genuinely begun the work of change. Sirens were installed. Some alert systems were improved. Camp safety protocols were reviewed. None of that was fiction, and none of it should be dismissed, because it is very likely that the improvements already in place are part of the reason this year's death toll, while tragic, was a fraction of the year before. But the work was not finished. It could not have been finished, not in 12 months, not across a region as large and as rural as the Hill Country, not with the scale of infrastructure that true flood resilience requires. Complete warning coverage across dozens of counties, upgraded river gauges on every vulnerable waterway, enforceable safety codes for every camp and RV park sitting in a floodplain, all of it takes years and sustained funding. Not a single budget cycle following a tragedy, and not even the 4 decades that separated 1987 from 2025 proved to be enough. And so, the Hill Country now sits in an uneasy space between 2 truths. It is safer than it was in July 2025, and it is still, fundamentally, one of the most flood-prone regions in the entire United States, a place where limestone bedrock, steep terrain, and a climate of feast or famine rainfall will keep producing the conditions for disaster, no matter how many sirens are installed. The question hanging over this land is no longer whether another flood will come. Geology, climate, and a century of repeating history have already answered that question, and the answer is yes. The real question, the one officials, engineers, and families along these rivers are now forced to sit with, is whether the region can finish building the systems meant to save lives before the next storm decides to test them again, and whether the next generation will still be telling this same story on the same river in another 38 years. For the people who live here, that question is not academic. It is personal, And it is close. It is Jenny Stewart, standing in the wreckage of a life interrupted, grieving a husband swept away in an RV on a road he had likely driven 100 times before. It is Richard and Lavonda Coons, watching the Camp Mystic tragedy unfold on television in 2025 and recognizing, with a dread only survivors can feel, the exact shape of their own worst day 38 years earlier. It is the counselors and staff at camps along the Guadalupe, checking cabin rosters against flashlight beams, praying the siren gives them enough time this time. It is Jacqueline Gonzalez, stepping out of bed into water that should not have been there, and cat sprawls, waking on the 6th ring to a warning that almost came too late. There's a version of this story that ends with reassurance, the version where new sirens save the day and a hard lesson is finally fully learned. There's another version, quieter and harder to sit with, where the sirens that worked this time were only ever installed along the stretches of river that made headlines the year before, while the county without a single listed wireless alert waits its turn for funding that may or may not come before the next storm. Both versions are true at once, and that is precisely what makes this such an unsettling story to tell. Progress and failure are not opposites here. They are running side by side, down the same river, through the same night. Engineers who study flood mitigation will tell you that a warning siren, however well placed, is only ever the last line of defense, the final alarm bell in a system that should have started working days earlier with better land use planning, stricter limits on building in known floodplains, and river basin-wide coordination between counties that too often act alone. Some of those harder, slower reforms are now being debated in Austin, in county courthouses, and in the camp associations that oversee the youth facilities scattered along these rivers. Whether those debates translate into permanent funded change or fade the way so much of the momentum after 1987 eventually faded will likely determine how the next chapter of this story is written, and how many more names get added to a list that already stretches back nearly a century. The rivers of the Texas Hill Country have receded again, for now. The mud is being cleared. The rebuilding, again, will begin. Families will return to homes, still smelling faintly of the flood, and campers will return to cabins along a river that has now taken lives in 3 separate summers across 3 separate generations. But somewhere above that same limestone plateau, the atmosphere is already gathering the ingredients it needs to do this again, because it always has, and because nothing about this land has changed at its core since 1932, since 1978, since 1987. What has to change is what happens between the moment the sky darkens and the moment the water reaches someone's front door. In 1987, that gap cost 10 young lives. Last year, it cost more than 100. This year, faster warnings and hard-won lessons helped close it, just enough, for some, while leaving others exactly as exposed as they had always been. The next flood is not a question of if, it is only a question of when and whether, by then, the warning will finally reach everyone in time, in every county, on every road, in every home along a river that has never once stopped keeping score.